All right, all right, all right. Hello, Bernadette. Hello, Andre. Sending you all so much love today. Hey, 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 hey. And hey, everybody. Welcome to the Santita Jackson Show here on AM 950 Radio, the voice of progressive Minnesota. It's a joy to be with you today in the midst of so much excitement, I would say, in the world. So much is being unearthed. In the midst of all this tumult, there are blessings, everybody. A lot that has been hidden down through the years is now being revealed. We're talking, we're having conversations, and we're watching. Oh boy, it reminds me of the Bible saying, and the last shall be first. Those who were colonized are rising up and they are demanding their seat at the table. Everything is changing. Everything is changing. And let's look at Venezuela. Let's look at Venezuela. America has been committing, according to many international observers, extrajudicial killings. Um, and indeed, President Trump said, "Well, if we find these people, we're going to kill them, and they'll be dead. They'll be dead." Wow, what a thing to say! Allegedly killing people who are bringing drugs into the United States. Now, no one's talking about the appetite for drugs and arresting that. Why is it that Americans feel the need to take so many drugs? Why? Indeed, James Early, my father was in Nicaragua during his first presidential campaign, and he came back with a story of his interaction with a young boy who said, "Reverend Jackson, we can't get you with our guns, but we can get you with our drugs." Think about that, everybody. Not that that's what they want to do. Everybody reaches out to America first. Castro reached out to America. The PLO reached out to America. Mandela reached out to America. Please, Dr. King was pleading with America. Of course, Malcolm X wanted America to be right. Reverend Jackson, and on and on. And of course, Mr. Early is in that tradition. And we're so glad that we had someone like you at the Smithsonian
Mhm.
to help get the record straight, the former director of cultural studies and communication at the Center for Folk Life Programs. Whenever I go to Washington, I go to the Smithsonian's before the African American Museum would open, and I would go to the bookstores and I would get all of these wonderful books and recordings of formerly enslaved African Americans who would tell their stories. And I want to thank you for really protecting our collective history. Thank you so much for that. James Early, you were with us last week, and I told you you were going to be right back because
Yes.
I want us to talk about what's happening in Venezuela. I think we need to know. Um, Anytime the spokesman for President Lula da Silva of Brazil, and make no mistake, Brazil is a global economic giant, and they're growing every day. Every day. They said attack Venezuela, if you attack Venezuela, you are basically risking the wrath of all the global South. The radicalization, he said, of this whole region, the whole region. Think about that, everybody. It could inflame, he said, the South America and lead to radicalization of politics on the whole continent. And this is a top aide to Brazilian President Lula da Silva. And what is he talking about? Well, he's talking about bombings, quite frankly. A lot of Venezuelans are being killed, and we're threatening to put our troops on that land. And I want to talk with James Early about that, but then I want to go back because I think that we need to understand the context in which this is happening. I think it's important for us to, because many of us do not travel, Mr. Early, we need to know why people feel as they do. We don't know their stories. You talked on Reverend Jackson's radio show a little bit earlier today, Keep Hope Alive with Reverend Jesse Jackson, about the vast inequality in South and Central America, particularly in South America. And oh my goodness, when you go down there, you will see it. I remember I was confined to my hotel in Brazil because they said, no, no, there's This is the best hotel in the city. And if you leave, you could be at risk, even though Brazilians look just like you and me. But still, what is going on in Venezuela? Extrajudicial killings. What is that? Why are we bombing these boats? What is going on? They say we're looking for drugs, and yet that's not where fentanyl is coming from. Help us all to understand, what are we looking at?
Well, let's start with looking at, as more recent times of 1998 with the emergence of President Hugo Chavez, who raised the issue of the Bolivarian Revolution, keeping in mind that Bolivar led the revolutions against Spanish colonialism, and what we know today as Venezuela was the first country to defeat Spanish colonialism. But he defeated that by going and asking these ex-enslaved Haitians, the president of Haiti, to give him quote unquote men and boats, which was done. And he went back and started a revolution to free what today is Panama, which was then a part of Colombia, Venezuela, Peru, Bolivia. The Bolivarian Revolution lives, and Hugo Chavez then opened up. We owe a debt to Haiti, and we must organize ourselves, not just proclaim we owe that debt. And he and Fidel Castro took the initiative to develop the Community of Latin America and Caribbean Nations, CELAC, with all of the CARICOM, the Afro Caribbean countries involved with Latin America, to advance their own sovereignty, their own self determination in terms of how they handle their internal national matters as well as their regional matters. This comes against the proclamation of the United States going back to 1832 of the Monroe Doctrine, in which the United States proclaimed that Latin America and the Caribbean was the U.S. backyard, and that this was their sphere of influence and no one else could penetrate. Well, as of 1998, we had this movement of these countries advancing their own sense of self determination. You mentioned Brazil. The census in Brazil, the voting census, 53% of the people who vote in Brazil identify themselves as negro, black, or raça mixta, mixed race. So the democratic question is one of the descendants of enslaved Africans, where about 10 million enslaved Africans were sent. I recently spoke, as of last week, to Jesus Chucho Garcia, the Venezuelan ambassador in a station in Benin, but he's the ambassador for West Africa, Senegal, and Ghana. He is the conceptualizer, the father of something called Afro epistemology, someone whom I've worked with for over 30 years, a little younger than I am, but quite active ethnomusicologist, etc. And I asked him about the statistics in Venezuela, and he says as much as 53%. That's a very interesting proposition. Of course, race is a social construct, are of African descent. People are identifying of African descent. So the threat against Venezuela, the world's largest repository of oil, that is the ultimate goal. But to get to that goal, regime change is the immediate goal, is to get rid of the successor of Hugo Chavez, a trade unionist who is President Maduro. The recent Nobel candidate, what a tragic irony, Maria Corina Machado, who was given the Nobel Peace Prize, who embraces Netanyahu and has asked Netanyahu to be a part of an invasion of Venezuela, and who dedicates her prize to Donald Trump and is supporting an invasion. So the implications for Afro descendants are really keen, but for citizens across Latin America in particular. President Lula da Silva of Brazil, some will recall that he went before Davos maybe 15, 20 years ago. This short, very white skinned man who comes from abject poverty in Brazil stood before the oligarchs and Davos and said to them, "You white men," there's one white man of his skin, but he's speaking from a socio-historic understanding of his own misery and background, which is categorized with what happens to Afro descendants and indigenous people, particularly women and children, who are the most exploited in the most unequal region of the entire world. The United States has now mounted a major flotilla, including a nuclear submarine, the largest ship with airplanes, which is the Gerald Ford ship that they have brought all the way from the Mediterranean, now in the Caribbean Sea, with several to 10,000 troops, 5,000 of so of whom are being organized in Puerto Rico and Vieques and other places as a launch pad. Now, as a result, the tinderbox gets more intense. As a result, President Nicolas Maduro has called for a national militia, and an extraordinary 15 million people in the last 2 or 3 weeks have responded, who are already on weekend training of how to organize themselves and how to use weapons. This is in addition to the military in Venezuela. President Petro of Colombia has also called out the United States as a renegade country, breaking all international laws, and it's violating. There have been several ministers from former prime ministers from the Caribbean, from Barbados and Jamaica and other areas, who have signed a proclamation calling for the U.S. to have dialogue and to respect the zone of peace. The zone of peace goes back to 1972 with then Prime Minister Eric Williams, the author of Capitalism and Slavery, a Howard University graduate who was Prime Minister of Trinidad, retrieving the 99-year lease that British colonialism had given to the United States to occupy a military base called Chihuahuas. And he was successful in getting the United States out. Now, the United States has gone into Panama bombing people, which was a predominantly Afro-Panamanian site in Panama. I did my sophomore year in college at Canal Zone College in Panama. They've gone into Haiti, displaced President Aristide. So there is a historical context of violating the sovereignty and the democratic rights of nations in Latin America and the Caribbean. Cuba, of course, the economic warfare that has gone on for an unprecedented number of years. The United States is now trying to strong arm countries in Latin America, the Caribbean, and around the world, not to oppose the economic warfare called which the Cubans call a blockade, but it really is an economic warfare, resulting in over 2 million Cubans in the last 2.5 years or so leaving Cuba. Over 2 million of a population of 11 million. Over 7 million Venezuelans have left in the last 3 to 5 years as a result of the economic sanctions, which is an economic warfare going on. And of course, this threat to Venezuela is also a threat to Mexico, where Trump has said he would go into Mexico against the cartels. No fentanyl comes out of Venezuela. Venezuela is minimally involved in the drug trade. It is Colombia where most of the cocaine is coming from. And they're bombing these small fishing boats that don't have the gasoline capacity or the size to reach the United States coastline. They barely can reach Trinidad, which is really, really close to Venezuela. So this is the lie that's being told and the war drums that are being mounted, and it will radicalize Latin America and the Caribbean further. What does that mean, radicalize? It means they will take additional steps to protect their national sovereignty and their own self-determination to make their own decisions. They will do it through advocacy in international bodies, but social movements, which are very strong in Latin America, more so than in the Caribbean, will also be on the march. And one cannot predict what citizens will do in addition to what organized militaries will do. The United States then is really on the verge of a regional war, not just against Venezuela, but it will involve Colombia because these are contiguous countries. They share borders. The fight back will occur in Venezuela. It will occur in Colombia. It will occur in Brazil, and it will seek into the Afro Caribbean, particularly with Trinidad, which also has a large quantity of oil and which is now complicit with the United States mounting this armed flotilla. So this is the context that we're looking at.
Why is Latin America, I guess it would be further to the left of the Caribbean nations? Why?
Well, because of the history of Spanish colonialism, in which it was Cuba is a part of the Caribbean. We must
Mhm.
remember that it is
Mhm.
a socialist. Well, it was not initially a socialist revolution. It was a radical national revolution that Fidel Castro called to unite all who could be united against the U.S. puppet president, who was a mulatto, partially black, who could not go into white Cuban clubs, although he was the president. Initially exiled, I think, in Miami and finally in Puerto Rico before he died. So Cuba is held up as a banner of standing up to the imperialist giant in the United States. And I say imperialist because of the expansionist nature of the United States, who protects its corporations by extending its economic oligarchic organization, working with elites in these countries. So in Latin America, the Spanish, they were the first to defeat Spanish colonialism. The Afro-Caribbean countries did not get their independence until the early '60s. So it's almost 100 years later that they began to emerge, and that is why of course, Latin American land base is much greater. It has many more natural resources, gas, the largest oil deposit in the world. Brazil has a lot of gas. Brazil also has a large oil deposit. Brazil is the largest producer of soy. They perhaps are maybe the major, if one or two major producers with cattle and meat in the world. Is beef consumption in places like Uruguay, huge underdeveloped land mass, and a huge Afro descent population. Of the 200 million Afro descendants in this hemisphere, in which the United States occupies, represents about 40 million. So you've got over 100 million. You've got over 100 million Afro Brazil self-identified as Afro descendants in Brazil. So, and they are the most impoverished, the highest incarceration rates, the highest abuse of women, the highest abuse of trafficking. This is across the region. So you have the highest index that wants to rise to basic liberal, if not radical democracy. And so from the bottom up, this is the reason. And then with all of the natural resources, one or two of the major pure water reserves in the world, and in Paraguay, is there. Again, the oil reserves, forests, the Amazon, gold. Hugo Chavez said they have all of the natural resources to be self-sustained. And then lastly, in the contemporary context, they have radicalized in the sense of turning away from a dependency on the United States because of the United States' violation of their rights, the imperial dominance of the United States of threatening them. China now is the largest country in terms of business and enterprise and investment relations in Latin America. Russia has also moved in there. Russia has also delivered to Venezuela missiles for the sea that can go out to 250 miles. And that would be a threat to this nuclear submarine and the Gerald Ford ship that is there with airplanes on it and the like. So this is the tinderbox, the context of the tinderbox, and the historical backdrop for what is going on today.
James Early, what will it mean for for American troops to land in a country that has 15 million volunteers in a militia?
There will surely be body bags. That's just the ordinary citizens who are armed. But then you've got the military, which up to this point has been loyal to President Nicolas Maduro. It was an element of the when the coup against Hugo Chavez and he was held up in the palace. It was an element of the military who supported that, but it was a larger element of the military who went in and freed Hugo Chavez, not because they were socialists, but because they were sovereign patriots whose position was, let us resolve our own internal disputes and contradictions. We will not allow anybody else to interfere. So certainly there would be body bags coming back if the U.S. decided to do that. It is likely that if this conflict is further initiated by the United States, it will be through drone warfare. Trump has already authorized the CIA to be on the ground in Venezuela, likely on the ground, looking not for drug targets, but for military sites, and trying to bribe and incite members of the military to go in a coup against their own government. This is the likelihood of what they will do before they would put troops on the ground. However, with the large flotilla of boats and submarines right there on the coast in the Caribbean, right off the coast of Venezuela, who knows what could happen uh, by uh, by people who want to incite the right wing under Machado, this so-called Peace Prize winner, has in recent times been importing munitions and other kinds of weapons, trying to organize. There was an attempt in the last few weeks. To put explosives around the U.S. embassy. That did not come from the Maduro government. It came from extremists on the right to try to incite a reason for the United States to invade. And
Oh,
of course,
wait, hold that thought, because I think it's important for us to understand that incitement can come, that incitement from the right typically favors the United States, yes?
yes, yes. And the United States, there are big debates historically. Who blew up the Maine in Puerto Rico,
Mhm.
excuse me, in Cuba
Mhm.
with a few hundred U.S. troops on it. Many people think the U.S. did that itself. We've seen in the case of Israel recently, and the Israeli government has admitted that they indiscriminately killed Jewish citizens because their orientation is, we will not allow you to take any hostages, and if the hostages must die. And so there's now documented evidence that a number of the first deaths of some of the Jewish hostages taken by Hamas were killed under the military orders. They were not targeted per se, but they were not protected. They knew where they were, and Mossad, not so incidentally, trains a lot of police in the United States as well as across Latin America. Mossad is in Latin America and the Caribbean. And there is a history of Nazism in Brazil and Argentina with colonies of ex-Nazis who were there. So white supremacy is a part of that context as well. And when you look at a country like Brazil, and all due respect to President Lula, whom I
Mhm.
personally know and have met on a number of occasions, and Danny Glover and I went down to demonstrate, and when he was in prison, Danny actually went into the prison. They were only allowing two people to go in that day, Danny and the former president who followed President Lula, to go in and visit him. But we've met with President Lula on a number of occasions in the last 25 years, and I say all do respect to them. When you look at Brazil, for example, on the top layer, notwithstanding some democratic advances with some elected black officials, it is basically a white-skinned country,
Mhm.
and so that this is going to be a part of the incentive for Afro descendants to be against the U.S. invasion because they are trying to advance within their own country, even as they oppose the United States government. Again, it is a tinderbox, and we need to call on U.S. citizens to speak out to their elected representatives, to demand that their elected representatives move away from these procedural positions of Schumer and Jeffries of the Democratic Party, who are simply saying, well, he's not come to Congress to get authorization. He's not come to Congress to for anything. It is a dictatorship in the White House with all of the oligarchs literally in the White House.
Mhm.
They are open. The graft is open when you have MSNBC and even Fox News to a certain extent talking about the graft and the corruption. We have to get away from the procedural issues of the Constitution says or the Congress procedure says, and begin to educate the public that these are lies that are jeopardizing not only the accumulated democracy that we have achieved, that is African Americans who have been the crucible, who've opened up the democratic run for the second wave of the women's movement, the LGBTQ movement, the Latino movement. Those are legal cases that were about the exclusion and the inhumanity against African Americans, that when they were won, they set a context for other people to look in the mirror of democracy and say, me too, I too am lacking in full access. And so we know in affirmative action, even elite white women with well-educated who were getting what 63, 73 cents on the dollar of men who went to the same schools with lesser grades. They too advanced. So this is why our citizens need to step forward and demand that our elected representatives tell us exactly what is going on. Tell us about the lie. There were 80, as I said, approximately 80,000 U.S. citizens from the consumption of fentanyl, not to mention cocaine.
Mhm.
Fentanyl died last year. There's no fentanyl produced in Venezuela. None. But even what's his name? Paul, the Republican, has called that out. There's no evidence. The bombing of these small fishing boats, we've seen no evidence of drugs. They just released two people in the last bombing on the Pacific coast. Two people survived, one from Peru, one from Colombia, not from Venezuela. And the US government released them. Why did they release them? Because they can't prove that they were carrying drugs. So they're indiscriminately killing poor, working class, marginalized citizens in Latin America. I think now 9 or 10 boats have been hit. They're up to almost 40, a little over 40 people who have been killed. But just as they are invading Chicago and dragging people out of windows and people who are undressed, locking up children, this fascism. We have to step up and get beyond the procedural issues of what the Constitution says, that they are violating congressional laws. And as we've seen the mayor of Chicago, who's called for a general strike,
Mhm.
uh, we the United States is now a rogue, fully a rogue nation in terms of the entire world. Trump recently at the United Nations, what did he call to the Europe? Your
Mhm.
culture is being tainted. It's being spoiled by these colored people, these immigrants coming in, speaking different languages, different religions, different ways of knowing and doing. And so it is the institutional of white supremacy now. They're attempting to spread it more deeply within Latin America. Trump is punishing through sanctions in Venezuela because he disagreed, not that he disagreed, he supports the right-wing fascist Bolsonaro uh,
Mhm.
uh, there. And so the United States is extending not only its extrajudicial killings, but it is saying that they are the global constitution. That is the MAGA Trump Republicans. And in transition, let's rest assured, this is not just Donald Trump.
Mhm.
Uh,
Please explain because he's the front man.
Yes, he's the front man.
Or
A fortunate find for them.
he,
He was not necessarily the one that they were looking for because he's really not dependable. He's a megalomaniac, and they don't know what he will do. He'll tear down the White House. He'll break all the laws. He'll even lock up Republicans. That's not what they were hoping for, but that's what they got. So
well,
this is
remember, he was going to run. If I may interrupt, he was going to run for president on the Ross Perot ticket. He's transactional. He was more of a Democrat than a Republican, and he was running as a populist in a populist moment. Right?
yes,
And Hillary Clinton got the women and the standard Democrats. Bernie Sanders got the progressives. He took what was left. I
right,
remember Roger Stone saying in an interview on CNN that when he and well, then Citizen Trump were first discussing the idea of him seriously launching a bid for the presidency, he said, "You do know, Mr. Trump, that you can bust this duopoly. You can bust the two-party system because your politics go right down the middle." And he said, and after he said this, I never saw him do interviews anymore. He said, um, but my disappointment was that he took the low hanging fruit, the white nationalist fruit. And now here we are. I
right.
didn't see him anymore after that.
After that,
After that. I mean,
well, recall.
but help me to understand because who are the puppeteers? Who benefits? What is it? Cui bono? Who benefits from the revolution from overthrowing Maduro and Lula?
Right. Uh,
And who benefits from was it Milei in Argentina? Who who benefits from these right wing and who benefits from overthrowing these populists? The
It,
wait a
it
minute, the left wing populists. Let me.
right. Two quick points here. Remember, it was Bill Clinton, the so-called first black president, who jokingly said to Donald Trump, "Well, why don't you run for president?" This says something about our electoral candidates who are not really tied to the ordinary everyday citizen. And that ordinary everyday citizen is not only bus drivers and nurses and street sweepers, but they're doctors and lawyers and school teachers, university professors who are truly looking for representation to bring governance policies that reflect their needs, like universal health care, et cetera. Who benefits from the overthrow of Maduro? It will be the right-wing oligarchic elites who are already selling their country. Marcos Rubio, head of the State Department, is already redeploying USSAID funds. They've dismantled USAID, but already taking those funds and spreading them around the region in support of this military effort and against Cuba vis-a-vis the UN. So it will be the elites of those countries with the oligarchs of this country. It will be Mobile, Chevron, others, the tech people who want those natural resources, who want control of pure water. The United States Congress approved, I forget what year, maybe it was in the 70s. There are 8 or 9 Colombian military bases that the United States has an agreement to occupy parts of those bases. Now, most of the cocaine comes out of Colombia.
Hmm.
They can't stop it. So what Trump is talking about cutting off military aid to Colombia, it's about 300 to 800 million dollars of other monies. So this is not a serious issue of dealing, and that those will be the who will not benefit from it. It will be the indigenous and Afro descendants and poor whites in Latin America who will lose out on this. They will be forced in these unnatural migrations. It is like a forest fire with animals. You see animals running from a forest fire to cross the rivers, going out into the
Hmm.
ocean, fleeing because they cannot contain it. Well, that's what these unnatural migrations about. And these unnatural migrations go on characteristically from the colonial historical South, except on the continent of Africa, where the economy of South Africa is perhaps the most efficient. The largest economy on the continent of Africa is in Nigeria, but you've got people leaving from above the Sahara, going south of the Sahara, all the way from Morocco and other places into South Africa and Nigeria. But then you've got Nigerians and Senegalese and Ghanaians and others fleeing Africa, dying in the sea off of Europe, stacked up outside the tunnel in London because of these forced economic migrations and the civil strife that goes on. And the United States is tied up into all of this. And the lie is so blatant. The Trump administration and Rubio are saying that these small boats, fishing boats, they're not ships, are equivalent to ISIS or Al Qaeda. It's just an outright lie. And we need our Democratic Party leadership and our independents and Bernie Sanders and AOC and others to call it a lie and to give us the details of why it is a lie, rather than talk to us about procedures that they haven't come to get approval to mount this war initiative. That is avoiding the issue. Are they going to say, of course, we're all against drugs? That does not explain the fact that Venezuela produces no fentanyl. It's not a drug, it's a transit country. And so this is a context of how we, the American citizens, as global citizens with others, have a responsibility to step forth and work with people in protecting their own independence and national sovereignty. And yes, raising criticisms where we think it's important to raise, but not interfering with their more natural processes, if you will, to resolve their own problems. Maduro is criticized by the Communist Party in Venezuela. That party was split. He recruited some of the members into his PSUV, the populist socialist party that was started under Hugo Chavez.
Mhm.
Um, Let them resolve their issues and not be the police people running around the world, not just the policemen, because there are many, many right wing women involved in this. And of course, when you look at the Black Caucus, many, if not most of them, are underwritten in by many people, but in part by APAC. It's not the Netanyahu financial pact. It is the Israeli financial pact, in which up to 60, I think maybe something like 63% of Israelis, probably the majority of who don't support Netanyahu, do support the expulsion of Palestinians. This is data in which our representatives are avoiding telling us. This is data in which the mainstream liberal media, Reverend Al, who applauded the Nobel Prize for Maria Machado, and says because Trump didn't get it, he applauded her as a woman of peace. And I wondered, does he really think that? Did somebody give him a piece of paper and say, well, here's a piece of news, read it this way? We have to, this is not about a personal attack on Reverend Al or on Jeffries
No,
or
no,
on
but
Reverend Reese.
it's
It's a policy question. It's a
yeah,
policy. Yes,
it's about
yes,
knowing the players. That's why I'm asking you these questions because
yes, yeah. And
who,
so
yeah,
we as citizens have to demand, because they are the ones who have responsibility not just for their state representation and districts and states, but for oversight of the whole country. The average citizen, again, who's cleaning a floor, or who is a doctor or a lawyer in Minneapolis or in Chicago, does not have the responsibility, nor the time, nor the data access to have a panoramic view of what goes on in the nation at large, in which the notion of striking the well-being is looking at the different requests and demands from citizens all over the country, even within one state, and to trying to make a decision: do we build a bridge or do we build a new skyscraper? What is most important for the well-being? Where is the compromise that affects and uplifts most of the people? It's not that one is good and one is bad, but what has the most horizontal uplifting factor? And in regards to what's going on in this economic warfare around the world, particularly against Cuba and Venezuela, uh, we need the data. This is not a drug
wait a
interdiction
minute, and
operation.
you say this is global against Cuba and Venezuela because I
I,
think
I,
a story that was missed, I think that I never really hear about. I bumped into it that they found a tranche of oil off the coast of Cuba that would make them OPEC eligible. And no one, and I said on one of my old shows, I said, we're about to open up relations with them, everybody. Pay attention. This was like 2006 or so.
right, right.
And, and darn it, that is what happened. And I mean, help me to understand then, help us to understand, because you're helping us to understand who these people are. You're putting flesh on these bones. How then should we look at the Venezuelans who come here? So many of them have come here, and I maintain that they weren't trying to come to America. They've been pushed out of their country.
Right. So there is no question, uh, and it should not be surprising because this is a universal matter, that some citizens in Venezuela oppose the Bolivar and Revolution context in general, and the Maduro administration expression of that specifically, as were there some citizens who opposed Hugo Chavez. But they are patriots. They share a common interest in the preservation of the independence and the sovereignty and the right of the citizens in the country to be self-determination, to have their own arguments and to come to their own resolve. So it is not a one is not necessarily wrong because you're in the opposition, or right because you support the government, but that's the context of patriotism. So many of these citizens, I would suggest to you, most of them are economically forced out.
Mm.
They can't. Uh, the case of Cuba, for example, the economic warfare called the embargo, which the Cubans called the blockade, appropriately from their vantage point, but from our vantage point, in order to defeat it and to dismantle it, it is a legislative embargo. So we have to deal with our reality here. It is devastating the healthcare system there. The Rubio Trump administration and the Biden administration participated in this, saying that Cuban doctors are enslaved.
Mm.
They are all around the world, even in places like Italy. Five vaccines, effective vaccines against COVID, but with great difficulty of getting a basic instrumentality like needles
Mhm.
because of the US economic warfare against it. The same in Venezuela. They're squeezing the economy. The medical system is in crisis. And so people leave. They're fleeing economically to basically earn a decent living. And so now they're
Wait, is that why they're being treated as enemies here? Is
well,
that
they're being treated as enemies here because of the racism, the white supremacy. Uh, let's be clear: this administration and the MAGA movement, the Make America Great Again, the
Mhm.
anti-diversity, inclusion, and equity reads color, culture, gender, including white women, when it comes to in many places. We saw what happened to I forget one example of a number of examples. We saw what happened to McCain.
Mhm.
Uh, but it is basically a racialized nature going after black and brown people. The black women, state leaders who have been targeted, uh, Letitia James, and
Mhm.
these are high. The calling of Mrs. Obama a monkey. Um, uh, this really in dehumanizing, racialized attempt, and the reinstallation of a Eurocentric. All things in Europe are not bad,
Mhm.
but when you say that that is the paradigm by which everything else is measured, that is discriminatory. And it can be easily, as Du Bois said in 1953, that behind the color line, he recognizes that there are a minority of people who want to live in with the surplus money, and it's highly racialized. And then in order to preserve it, they're willing to go to war against people of color. A
But
five-sentence paragraph, 1953,
Mhm.
as he looked back on souls of black folk. When you look at the conflagration going on in the world and these migratory patterns, yes, there are white people who are migrants, but this is highly colorized, highly
Mhm.
racialized, both inside the United States and the effect is always worse against the most marginalized people in society. So the Afro descendants in Brazil, women and children in particular, along with indigenous people, will be hardest hit, as is the case here in the United States, as is the case in the city of Chicago. Who are the people that will be most affected? The black doctors, lawyers, nurses, university professors, there will be a racialized impact. But it is the deep South Side of the people who have not had the greatest access
Mhm.
to education, who've been in those housing projects for 3 or 4 generations, whose uncles and aunts and increasingly women aunts and mothers have been incarcerated, sometimes for 2 or 3 generations, and they have only seen them in prisons. These are the democratic questions. Those are the demos, the ordinary people who
Mhm.
lack the kwasha, the power. And so we should measure democracy not by the middle class, but by the most marginalized. And that is also the case, as we will see across Latin America and the Caribbean, including in the Afro Caribbean, where
Mhm.
it will be fundamentally a class question, but there is also a colorism question. When you get to places like Jamaica, when you get to places like Haiti. And we know that from our playground experience. I'm a little older than you. I was born in 1947, but you know this from your playground experience. If you're black, get back. If you're brown, stick around. If you're white, you're all right.
And
Where do
if you're
children,
yellow, you're mellow.
where do children learn that from? They learn it from the internal colorisms of the communities in which they are born across class lines. imposed by the largest society that says the more you look European and act European, the more you will be accepted basically into a fuller second class citizenship. It's
But
not, yeah.
well, no, 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 no.
Yeah.
I think it's important because I think because it's so pronounced when you go to Central and South America. You know,
Yes.
there's a lot that we dealt with here. We're still dealing with it in the United States. But that's why I was asking the question about specifically about the politics, the fear of the politics of the Venezuelans who are here, because we welcome right wingers, right? Uh,
Yes.
but if you now don't bring that revolution talk to the United States now.
Nope. Nope. Nope.
Now that's a problem, and I'm wondering
Right.
if, as we're looking, because we have demonized the Venezuelans, I'm wondering if because they are economic refugees and not social and political refugees, if that's also a problem in terms of how we perceive them, that how the government, not people on the ground, but how the government perceives them.
Well, this is somewhat of a complex issue. These people, as we saw under COVID, who runs the country? So when you go to the hospital, how many African and Caribbean nurses do you see? You see a lot of them. Why? Because in the US, we don't fund nursing schools as we should. We raid South Africa. I remember being on a plane to South Africa and meeting all of these nurses because they're English speakers, so they easily fit in. Or we raid the Caribbean after the people have put their taxes to help educate these people and bring them in, and we don't really produce the kind of nursing education we need here. What are the growers in California saying? And many of these are part of the corporate world in California saying this policy of expelling these brown people, these Latin Americans, for the most part, we have crops spoiling in the field. We don't people. I was just talking to a black builder here, a young woman in her 50s, and she says workers and people are afraid to come to work. She's not talking about black workers afraid to come to work. If you look at you go out on the streets and see in the street repairs, it is hard to find black people doing that. Who's doing that work? Latino crews. Or if you go into parking lots, who's running most of the parking lots? Somalians and Ethiopians. This is the contradiction. The people who are really the service workers of the country, who the bus drivers, the train drivers. These are the black men and women who make life palatable for us when doctors and lawyers and professors can stay home during COVID and work on their computers. You can't do that driving a bus or driving a train or cleaning a floor or working in an emergency room. This is where the colored people are. These are the people that Du Bois talked about in 1903 when he says, I'm addressing the souls of black folk to the colored people of the world. Why? Because it was the colored people of the world who were being colonized. It was the Indonesians, it was the Filipinos, it was the Africans. It was not just black skinned people, but characteristically people of color. And yes, there are poor white people. Most of the people who are poor in this country are white. But we would not know that even from our liberal media and from our liberal politicians, because the lie has been told that the color of poverty and the color of disease and the color of criminality is black and brown. So this is the contradiction that we're facing. The many of the corporations are suffering who support Trump and MAGA, but who are suffering because of the racialized policy here. And we must remember on the liberal side, we must deal with the fact that it was Joe Biden. That's who is the Supreme Court, Black Supreme Court Justice,
Ketanji Brown Jackson.
Clarence Thomas. We have
Oh,
who stood against a black woman,
no, no,
who's
please
charged.
forgive me. I said Ketanji Brown Jackson,
No,
but
no, right,
Clarence
right.
Thomas.
So
I'm
and
blocking. I'm
right,
blocking.
and we also have to face the fact that while this is a characteristically racialized
Mhm.
authoritarianism, even MSNBC places are using the word fascism. and it has high degrees of misogyny. We now have brown and black people, Clarence Thomas being one of them, Rubio and Cruz being others of them. I've been trying to think of the name all morning. In South Carolina, who's a part. So these are not people who are alienated from being black, who are traitors, because we are part of the human species with the ability to make independent decisions. These are people who don't want to just be a part of the system. If they have the opportunity, they will try to run the system. And little Marco, as Trump calls him, he's running for president. He's not just running to run the State Department. He's not running to just tail behind the white supremacist Trump, whose father was a known racist in his housing project in New York. This is the biggest simple narrative that we have to help people engage more if we're going to resolve the problems in part and in whole by accurately describing what we're facing.
We do need to understand what we're facing, because I think that when you give us this context, one sees uh, the attacks upon Venezuela, uh, and throughout the Caribbean, and the support of Milei in Argentina.
Yes,
It sees, you see, and it's very interesting because uh, these people, they have a lot of interesting connections internationally. And it's just, and then I think looking at the post World War II period, and look at who was deposited in
right,
South and Central America, who was
right.
deposited in our scientific programs, and
Yes,
and it was Nazis. And
yes.
so it's like you have these. Am I correct? I only have a couple of minutes left here, but we really have. You said extreme wealth, extreme poverty,
Poverty.
extreme progressive politics, extreme right wing politics. Is that it?
That is it. But I think we
But
also
more.
have to face the fact that in most of these cases, it is the general public under liberal democracy that is electing these people. And while Trump and what's his name in Hungary and Bolsonaro and many
Or,
and
mhm.
others are really becoming dictators, and Trump is a sort of dictatorship of the oligarchs right in the White House. The importance of liberal and progressive and even radical elected officials and intellectuals and educators telling us the simple truth is to give the ordinary citizen, again, from bus driver and sweet cleaner right up to lawyer and doctor, such that we make more informed decisions. We are elected. I am less worried in the long run about Donald Trump than I am about my fellow Americans who are MAGA.
Mm.
And some of them are white supremacist MAGA, and some of them are protecting their portfolio MAGA, and some of them just don't care who gets stomped, raped, or pillaged in the process as long as they can live in their gated community. So that is not to call all of them deplorables. It is to recognize that there are diverse interests, self interests, and so that we have to have a more politically astute citizenry not to elect these people, including not to elect these centrist Democrats who are taking APAC money, who are de facto supporting the slaughter of Palestinians, this constitutional apartheid in Israel. That's what it is. It's a constitutional apartheid in Israel, uh,
Mhm.
and where the South Africans said it is worse than anything that they ever experienced. And on the one hand, we all supported the liberation of South Africa against apartheid, although Mandela was still called a terrorist well after he was freed and well into his presidency.
While
And
he
that
was
was on
visiting the United
in the
States.
States and under liberal Democrats still. And so our citizens have to become more proactive in the context of Hugo Chavez, a participatory cultural democracy, not a passive one where we elect people, a rainbow coalition where people are actually networks of networks in movement with the candidacy, the candidate being closely tied to the views and aspirations of people, not a vertical figure simply trying to represent them, but a social individual, her or his ability noted, but circumscribed by the fact that they are social, not individual. And we have too many people who are just running for professional individual
Mhm.
candidacies, not for social candidacies. We have the case of Mandami in New York.
Mhm.
Finally, Jeffries has not endorsed him. He recognizes that Cuomo and Adams have already lost. And so he's got to make a tactical decision because if citizens, and Mandami didn't elect himself, it
Mhm.
is citizens, it is 60 some percent of the Jewish population in his district who is supporting him, not because some of them are not Zionists, but they don't want to be the human beings that they are seeing displayed by the Israeli government and the
Mhm.
slaughter. There are many factors that come in his governance policies, not
Mhm.
because he's Muslim,
Mhm.
because his name is Kwame and he's born in Uganda. Those are factors that will repel some people and attract other people. But basically, people are supporting the affordability governance model and the international arena. He has made some contradictory statements against Cuba and against Venezuela,
Mhm.
but those are not the most immediate
Mhm.
governance policy issues of why. So we have to get the public to be more astute and who we get to represent us and demanding that they work with us and that they become, as the right wing has become, daily political educators, bringing down this lie about Venezuela. It is not about drugs. Venezuela doesn't produce drugs. It produces no fentanyl. It is about oil, but in order to get to that oil, it's about regime change to get rid of Maduro with all of his virtues and all of his faults, and he has both of them. To get rid of him reopens the country to be taken over by the right wing elite to build their relationship with the oligarchs of this country to take advantage of the world's largest oil deposit and to be another spear in the heart of Latin America up against the progressive tide, like Petro in Colombia, Francia Marquez, the Afro Colombian, who's vice president of Colombia, against Lula da Silva, the social democrat with the Workers' Party in Brazil, and the progressive movement of people like Prime Minister Mia Moore of Barbados, who's leading the charge against the international global financial institutions that have been strangling the democratic process in these small developing countries.
James Early, everybody, talk about getting some clarity. I needed that. I think we all needed that. We need to understand that we can't be passive if we're going to be citizens in a constitutional republic.
That's yes.
Requires your engagement. If you want a constitutional monarchy, well, you let other people run things. But if you want to be a citizen in a republic, what did the woman ask Benjamin Franklin at the end of the Constitutional Convention? She said, "Sir, what kind of government have you given us?" He said, "A republic, if you can keep
You
it."
bet. Yes.
If you can keep it.
Let's see
Some
that.
historical recountings of that even have her name. I'm going to pull that up. But that is it. And I thank you for this clarity because it helps us to see, it helps us to understand everybody just a little bit better. It helps us to understand Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz and Gloria Estefan and
Yes.
the, I mean, just all of these people who talk about peace and freedom, and I want freedom in Cuba. Really? They went from being the most illiterate nation in the hemisphere to being the most literate. How do you need to
Right.
help me
Right. Right.
understand that? You just
Right.
you need to understand because Cuba was a place before Castro that my grandmother said, she said we were little more than slaves there. She's not Cuban, but she was a migrant worker there. And my heart cracks for my grandmother because she had been orphaned at 11 and she was out in the world by herself with a dog to keep her company. And she would hop on the boat and go to work. That's how she ate. But my grandmother was not a light skinned woman at all. She looked, when Nigerians would see her, they would say, "My sister." That's what she looked like. So there was a social mobility that she did not have, that, say, my father's people had.
Yes.
So it's, I think it's important for us to understand all of those layers. There's a young brother, or young son, I would say, on in social media now. I think it's Rodrigo Ignacio, and he's a Mexican American who talks about colorism. And we have to understand how much that figures into life there. And
In
so,
Mexico, yes. And
yes,
I'm not sure it's actually the last census, maybe the one before, but I think it may be the last census. Over 1 million Mexicans identified as Afro Mexicanos. Over,
unbelievable.
and with
And seeing them.
within a range of colors, but they recognize
Mhm.
that if you're not of white skin, then pigmentocracy, that is democracy based on shades. At one point in the history of Brazil, there were 120, 130 skin. Can you imagine this?
Yes.
120, 30 skin color designations, and where people, that's how people were valued. And of course, even here in the United States, up until the late 50s, maybe even in the early 60s, there were several states in the United States who had these mestizo laws. That's how we get octoroons and quadroons from New Orleans, the blue bloods of Charleston. But these were legal formulations based on this imposition of white supremacy and these symbols that is really a kind of illness of self-hate,
Mhm.
if you will. And so
I
I think
can't
we're
wait to.
probably
We've got because I want you to talk about the Melungeons.
yes, and then you've got the Melungeons, yes,
Because
and the Appalachian place, yes, yes. But I hope we can talk about Cuba not too distant from now because this is the centennial year
I want to do
of the
that.
birth of Fidel Castro, and to hook that to the World Conference Against Racism in 2001, in which he made an extraordinary presentation, and to look at the anti-racist movement in in socialist Cuba today, in part through its president, who has set up a special presidential commission, which he convenes, so that we see what the internal question of
Mhm.
democracy in Cuban socialism, not against Cuban socialism, but within how they're debating their errors and failures and discriminatory issues, and how through peaceful engagement and some criticisms to be raised about censorship and other things, but they're trying to resolve their own internal issues and build upon what they were able to accomplish with their revolution, because there are no paradises on earth, there are no utopias on earth.
Oh
We
no,
we strive for them, but our reach must always exceed our grasp in that regard.
James Early, you are an absolute gem, and what a trove! What a trove! I mean, just what a trove of information you are. Just and thank you for the wisdom.
And thank you for the educational platform, not just for people, me, but the engagement with audiences, the voices, the multi dialogue that you have, not at your audiences, but with your audiences. This is a very important. It's not just a radio or an online program. These are public fora in which we, the public, have an opportunity to speak, to criticize, to listen, to find just compromises, and continue to, in peace and respect, figure out our differences as we go along. And so I thank you and for your colleagues in the media for bringing these platforms forward, because they're very important in contrast to the censorship and the narrowness that we have with some very, very talented people, including some very, very talented Black women, Latino, Asian Pacific American
Mhm.
pundits and media people in the mainstream who are not stretching in the way that you and others are stretching to open up a public forum for us all to engage.
Well, thank you. I mean, you keep me inspired, and I thank you for that.
Thank you.
May God bless you. AM 950 Radio, the voice of progressive Minnesota, the Santita Jackson Show. Thank you